We Are Vineyard.
A community that laments has some of the most exciting, dynamic worship experiences you can imagine.
Yeah.
Because there's an acknowledgement of lament. There isn't a shoving aside or just sweeping under the rug. Everybody knows that there's moments of lament. But that honesty with God, which to me is what lament is at the center of it, honesty with God, leads us to be able to say, okay, then it's out of my hands. It's in God's hands. Versus I've lamented now, and now what can I do next to fix this thing? Versus I'm in a state of lament, but it also means that I'm in a state of dependence upon God. And that's where my hope is. That's one of the pieces that recognizing that getting out of lament is not a human accomplishment. It is actually a God's graciousness. And how does that change the way we begin to approach lament?
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. In today's episode, our host, Jay Pathak, is joined by Professor Soong-Chan, author of Prophetic Lament. Let's listen in.
Well, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate you making time.
My pleasure.
And we've not had any time to hang out, and we're recording in one of the weirdest ways I've ever recorded. And I'm in my car with a microphone doing this by way of Zoom. And you already made a good SNL reference because I look bizarre. I'm in a car with headphones on and a mic. It's pretty weird, but
it's the most elaborate getup I've seen anybody in a car. So please don't drive while you have that whole thing on.
I won't.
That would not be
I'm going
good.
to stay right here. I promise. It's got a great range. I've got some Wi-Fi here, so I tested it all out. But and like I was telling you before, it's just basically story. So let's just start where the beginning would be for you, which would be, where were you born?
Sure. Actually, could I go even further back?
Oh, I like it.
Right? Go back a couple
like
of generations. And this comes from my very recent experience. I went to Korea a couple of months ago to speak at a conference on the North and South Korean reconciliation movement. And then I just spoke at a conference for missionaries or those who are thinking about missions in Asia, and including those who were thinking about missions to North Korea. And it caused me to reflect and examine my Christian roots in my family. So on my father's side, my grandparents on my dad's side were a part of the participants and actually kind of they were young adult leaders at that time of of a pretty major revival movement in Pyongyang, Korea. And if you know anything about like the Welsh revivals and the Great Awakening, the Pyongyang revival actually rivaled that in many ways. Pyongyang is currently the capital of North Korea, but it was also the hub of missionary activity, and it was also the hub of spiritual renewal and revival. And in 1908, when the revival broke out, it led to some significant growth of the church in that area, and my grandparents were a part of that, and my dad eventually as well. But then because of the war, they fled south, and they ended up in Seoul, where they converted from Presbyterians to Baptists and joined Seoul Baptist Church, which at one point was the largest Baptist church in the world, the Southern Baptist Church in South Korea. And so I'm trying to kind of recover some of my Christian heritage, that my grandparents were involved in this revival in North Korea, and then they were involved in this very significant church in South Korea in Seoul, and that's where my parents met, actually, and they met in Seoul, South Korea. So I was born in Korea. I didn't know any of this history until kind of recently, as I was planning to go and speak at this conference, realizing that the North-South reconciliation was right in my family. My father's side of the family coming from North Korea, my mom's side of the family actually coming from the southern tip of Korea, and both of them meeting in Seoul. So that was an important part of my understanding of my Christian heritage, third-generation Christian, with this kind of revival movement and church growth and exciting kind of church stuff that had been happening in my family's story. But I was born in Korea and moved to the U.S. when right after my 6th birthday. And the background of my life in Korea, and this is a little bit silly, but I was a child model in Korea. So
that's awesome, man. We gotta find a picture for the notes
Well, I still have a few, actually.
I love it.
This is the crazy story. I was in Korea. This is not this recent time, but a few years back, I was in Korea again. And we're at this souvenir shop. And I'm going through the carts where they sell like postcards of like culture and life in Korea. And I saw a packet of postcards, and I looked at the cover and I said, I don't know why, but this photo looks familiar. So I opened it up, and it's a series of photos about life in Korea. And I'm in 3 of them.
Wow.
When I was 4 or 5 years old, they took these photos. 45 years later, they were still selling these postcards. And I obviously haven't seen a dime of that. No royalties or anything of that sort. But if anybody's ever in Korea at a souvenir shop, you might run across a postcard and they say, hey, that looks like Prof. Ra. It actually is me. So just to give a heads up for those who are there. So that's my background in Korea. I was born in Korea. Was a child model in Korea, and then we came to the U.S. and lived in Baltimore for many, many years.
So you lived there how long? From 6 to?
I'm trying to remember that because it was when I was a kid. And what happened was my dad left our family, and so my mom was a single mom with 4 kids. I'm the youngest, and so that's when we moved into Baltimore because we really couldn't afford to live anywhere else. And it was, I believe, it was about 4 or 5 years during my elementary and junior high school years. Yeah, around that time. And my mom worked really hard to get us out of that neighborhood. And we moved to a more suburban neighborhood, Columbia, Maryland, actually, which was a little safer, little less roach infested, little less, rodents. And, it was a different neighborhood than I grew up in when we were living in Baltimore, inner city Baltimore. So, I remember growing up in Baltimore, looking around my neighborhood, which was a third Black, a third white, and a third recent immigrant, mostly Korean, and recognizing even in elementary school and junior high school, which is when I was in that neighborhood, how segregated we were. Even though we were all in the same neighborhood, we were all, most of us, if not all of us, were on food stamps and living in subsidized housing. And yet our communities didn't get along with each other. Maybe okay in elementary school. Division was more evident in junior high school. And then by high school, full-blown gangs and strong racial division along those 3 kind of lines of immigrant, Black, and white. So that framed my thinking quite a bit about, well, what does that mean for people to not get along, even though there's the commonality of poverty, the commonality of struggle, yet why is it that we still can't get along with one another? And so a lot of my work actually theologically has been to reflect on that, to say, are there ways that, because I didn't see it in the church either. I didn't see it in my neighborhood. I went to church, and the church was maybe even more segregated. At least in the neighborhood, my neighbors were different race and ethnicity, but we didn't talk to each other, but they were still there. In the church, everybody was the same ethnicity and race, and there was this hyper segregation that was even more recognizable in the church than in the local community. So that has been an important part of my formation, and what's important to me when I think about what is the role of the church in the midst of an extremely segregated society, and oftentimes falling along racial lines.
And were you raised? So you were raised in church. So church was a part of everyday life.
Yeah, and that comes from my family background. Because of my dad's family heritage, and my mom and dad met at a church, and they met at Seoul Baptist Church. So when we got to the U.S., we were attending a Baptist church for many, many years, and then a United Church. I think back in the day when immigrant churches were smaller, they kind of threw all the denominations together into one church and called it the United Church. So we were at the United Church for a little while, and then went back to the Baptist Church, which is where I became a Christian at the Baptist Church. So we were going to church that whole time. And one of the things I noticed that my mom's struggle as a single mom, as an immigrant, we were poor, so we were on food stamps and, government subsidized housing, all the kind of stuff that people look down upon. And she didn't speak English very well. She was working at a inner city carryout. She was working at a nursing home as a nurse's aide, working very long hours. But at church, there was a place, especially in the Korean immigrant church that we were attending, where she was receiving a great deal of dignity and value as a spiritual leader. which obviously in society, she was not seen as a leader. She was not seen as someone that contributed because, again, we were a family on food stamps. We were living in an inner city neighborhood. My mom was working long hours, but really had trouble making ends meet because it's hard to do that as a single mom. But then at church, she would work 6 days a week, 20 hours a day. But on Sunday, she was very clear, this is the Lord's day, and we would go to church together. And of course, she would go to church and she would be in the kitchen making food for the elders and for the church. And she would work just as hard on Sunday as she did any other day of the week. But that was an example that she set for her children, that, part of your life is involvement and connection to the church. And it gave her dignity. It really did. She was acknowledged as a leader. She became a deacon at the church, and she was known as the prayer warrior that people would come to and ask for prayer whenever, at retreats, there would be a long line of people wanting her to pray for them. Those are the kind of things that I remember as part of my church life and formation, kind of seeing the restoration of God's dignity and glory on my mom, because the church recognized that and affirmed that.
Yeah. And through your childhood, then, church was positive. This was a good thing. Like, I'm excited to go to church. This is where my friends are. It's like it's a hopeful experience.
Yeah, very much so. And, again, even though we were a poor family, when we went to church, that was not an issue. And even though we were, my mom was a single mom, at the church, that was not a negative connotation. And for me, I was accepted in that community despite what might have been rejection by larger society. I'm an Asian kid, I'm a Korean kid, and sometimes that, by virtue of my race and ethnicity, I would face rejection among my peers at school. By virtue of our poverty, there was the opportunity for rejection at school and in this society. And it was in the church that actually there was a positive expression. You were of value because you were there. You were of value not because you had money or because you had stature in society or any of those things that I think, sadly, sometimes our churches have reverted to. We want power in society. We want power in our world. That wasn't what the church was about for me growing up. And this is my immigrant church experience, that
what a gift.
Most of us were marginalized already because of our race, because of our immigrant status, and because of our lack of education or whatever the situation might be. Most of us in the immigrant church had a degree of marginalization. We didn't speak English well, all those things. And yet in that community, we found support. In that community, we found affirmation. My mom, who was seen as an outsider and as a marginalized person in society, was an elder and a deacon.
She's a leader.
Church. Yeah, she's the leader at the church. And I felt that as well, even as a child. At school, I'm the kid on food stamp. I'm the kid with not good clothing. But at church, I was part of a spiritual community.
Well, what a witness for the church. That's what I think we all hope church would be for people.
I think so. And when I think about like youth ministry, I think that's one of those places where across race, class, political, social divisions, that's one of those things that I think the church can continue to offer in places like youth and college and young adult and children's ministry, a place where no matter who you are or what your background or what your hang up or what your stresses are, you find a community that accepts you and loves you and finds dignity and worth in you. And that was my experience growing up. And that was very formative for me as a Christian now, 45, 50 years later. I still look back at those moments and say, thank you, God, for that community that you provided for me.
So tell me about, because you've had you've done all kinds of interesting things. You're a pastor and a professor and a writer and all of these things. When did you start to have a sense of calling? Like, man, I think God is going to ask me to do this work. You already described looking around and noticing, man, there's divisions, there's ways that things don't seem quite right to me.
Yeah.
But when did God start to make it clear to you? Was it a fast thing? Was it in a moment? Was it through study? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there were multiple places. And one of the places is that when I through the church, I became a Christian, committed my life to Christ. It actually wasn't long after that I began to sense a calling to ministry. So this would have been about when I was 6 or 7 years old. No, I'm sorry, sixth or seventh grade. Sorry, 6 or 7 is
sixth,
really
seventh grade. So like 12, 13.
Yeah, in that age, like right at preteen, kind of early teens. I remember it was before high school. I remember kind of getting the sense of, am I going to serve God in some way? And a lot of that was kind of my mom's example of a really spiritually devout and really committed Christian walk that she was demonstrating, and feeling like that's something that I could be a part of and I could find my identity in. And it was throughout high school that was very strongly affirmed. I had a wonderful pastor who affirmed that. He started off as the youth pastor and then not long after became the senior pastor. And he was very encouraging about my kind of inquiry at that moment, that I was thinking, I think I might want to serve the Lord in some kind of full-time ministry capacity. The other factor, again, as I mentioned, in the immigrant church, there's always a shortage of workers, right? Because this is usually a resource-deprived community. Right. And so in the Korean church context that I grew up, the idea of being a pastor was not, you can't do anything else, and so you're going to be a pastor, or, you failed out of whatever med program, and so now you're going to go off and be a pastor somewhere. That actually wasn't the case. In the Korean church, it was seen as very much a high calling, noble calling, maybe because we have a higher percentage of those who are Christians, maybe because in the Korean church, oftentimes the pastor of the immigrant church was the most educated. So it was not seen as like an alternative, if all else fails, you're going to go be a pastor. But it really was seen as a noble and high calling. And so I felt that as a high school student, as I started to talk to my peers and to my pastor and to my youth workers, and they affirmed that. It wasn't like, no, go do something else. It really was, hey, maybe you do have that calling. And then when I went to college, I became involved with the varsity and I went to college in New York City, Columbia University, and being in that place where you had this real strong disparity of wealth and poverty. It's an Ivy League school that's right on the edge of Harlem and Spanish Harlem. So you see, like, literally looking out of your dorm room, you see the poverty. And then you turn around and you face the campus and you see these $1 million buildings with $1 million names attached to these $1 million buildings. So it was a real strong disparity. And in college, my heart for urban ministry, my heart for justice and care for the poor, because I grew up poor. But now is seeing it from the perspective of being in an Ivy League school and seeing poverty all around me in a different way. So that calling was affirmed when I was in college. I joke that the first time I really ever questioned my calling to ministry was when I was in seminary. And that's for real. I was really struggling with, is this real? And I think that's actually a legitimate thing for seminary students to struggle with that. Those of you who are in seminary or thinking about it, come to Fuller. But if you're thinking about seminary, that's where I teach. But if you're thinking about seminary, it's a good thing. But one of the things you should really struggle with when you are in a place like that is this really what God has called me to do? And that's when I remember having the most struggle of like, is this really what I'm called to do? And going through that, there was a strong affirmation of, this is my calling. And how that takes form has evolved and changed over the years. But I had the sense of I'm called to God's service in some form or another from a young age. It was affirmed by the community, which was great to have the pastors and my friends say, we think this is a good path for you. To have some of that experience in college and in seminary that allowed me to strengthen that calling. That's when you really rejoice in God's hand upon your life, because that's what I saw in my life leading me into this places of ministry.
That's so cool. Well, and tell me a little about, because I've been in a few different Korean church contexts. So you're growing up in Korean church, then next thing you know, you're in InterVarsity.
Yeah.
And so you're starting to experience different ways that people are doing worship and teaching. And so what were sort of the distinctives of the church you grew up in? And then how did you start to see different expressions as you moved into InterVarsity and maybe other church contexts?
Sure. Well, the immigrant church, and I've written on this as well as speaking from my firsthand experience, because there's the experience of marginalization from many immigrant communities. And it's not just immigrants, it's also African-American communities, rural poor communities, urban poor communities. There's linguistic barriers, cultural barriers, et cetera. When the experience in society is one of marginalization. The immigrant church, the African American church, churches in marginalized communities really offer a counter narrative to the existing narrative that tends to put down or diminish the contributions. And so for me, I found my formation to be helpful to be in the immigrant church. And I often say this, that culture and ethnicity are less of an issue in the immigrant church. And people intuitively think the opposite. Culture is an issue in the immigrant church. That's why the immigrants hang out together, because culture is such an issue. It actually is the opposite, because when you're in an immigrant church, you assume the culture. Everybody's the same culture. And so you don't have to worry about the culture. So in a Korean church, if someone brings kimchi for a potluck, nobody explains that. It's just what you do. You bring kimchi. Now, if I brought kimchi, and I've done this, I bring kimchi to an all-white church that I'm attending, I have got some explaining to do. I've got to explain, okay, I understand this is a very strong smell. It's not nuclear waste. It's not going to burn your stomach. It's not going to kill you. I've had to have those conversations when I'm bringing my culture into a different culture or even a multicultural context. I have to explain my culture. For the immigrant church or for monoethnic churches and monocultural churches, there's very little explanation of your culture. So culture is less of an issue in that context because everybody is of the same culture. And so in that kind of context, if you are experiencing marginalization, that's an important part of your formation, that you're experiencing marginalization. Like if you were, again, to bring kimchi to school, everybody would say, get out of here. What are you doing with that smell in the school? But you would feel that who you are, your identity, your name, I have a funny sounding name for many. I would get my name mispronounced at school all the time. I remember talking to my friends. It's like, oh, I love roll call because you get your name called and you get to stand up and say, here I am. I said, I hate roll call. That's the worst part of my day. I just look forward to having my name. Why would I enjoy that? And have my name butchered and all the kids laughing at me because I have a funny sounding name. I hate roll call. So those are the experiences that you say, well, but when I go to my Korean church, I don't have that. My name is funny sounding out there, but it's normal sounding here. My name, my families have, food that smells different out there, but here in the church, this is who we are. This is what we're about. So for me, that kind of, I would use the word empowerment, empowerment and a sense of God created me in this way, and that's not a curse. I could be a blessing towards others in my cultural identity, because of my culture, not in spite of my cultural identity, but because of my cultural identity. And that's a very affirming thing that society doesn't oftentimes offer. And that was my experience in the immigrant church.
And tell me, so, I've had an interview with Dennis Liu, who, if you don't know him, he's a wonderful friend in the Vineyard, wonderful guy leading our Asian American Association. And one of the things he's described is the dynamic of immigrant churches with the second generation, right? So you have first generation immigrant church, kids are growing up in sort of the larger culture, yet also are in their church. But as they get older, especially if they go to college, they suddenly are like, I don't want to go back to any of that stuff. So they're not looking often for, their immigrant church experience when they go to college. So, and then those churches start to dwindle and suffer, and there's challenges. And many of those kids don't even, embrace faith at all, maybe because they don't really know how to find church.
Yeah.
I mean, is that your experience, or what? How have you seen those dynamics playing out, maybe even in the church that you grew up in, or in churches like that across the country? What have you noticed? Does that ring true to you? Have you seen that as a trend, and what do you think is going on with all that?
Yeah. There's some pretty good research on patterns of growth and decline in immigrant churches more generally. And this starts before the recent wave, most recent wave of immigration, which would have been post-1970s. So even among like Swedish immigrants, you get some of these kind of similar dynamics. The immigrant generation is more churched. And then the second generation Their language is more English rather than Swedish, or English rather than German. And so these kind of ethnic, culture, national specific churches that were around in the 19th century, for example, and even in the early 20th century, they kind of fade away. And then the second generation from that community, second generation Germans and Swedes, et cetera, they assimilate more into the broader Anglo-white American culture. And that's pretty well documented. And you see that in many of our denominations in the U.S. actually have that heritage. Yep. CRC, RCA, the Reformed churches that are centered very strongly in the Michigan area. Why? Because that's where the Dutch immigrants went. And so they have a very strong Dutch immigrant background. The denomination that I'm a part of, the Evangelical Covenant Church, very strong Swedish background. You see the Lutherans, many of whom have of a German background. So you have these kind of immigrant communities that have a very strong beginning for the immigrant generation because they need that part of their home culture expressed in their church. But when you start getting to the second and third, the question is, does it actually translate over? And you see similar dynamics in the Korean church as well, that first generation. And this is in my book, The Next Evangelicalism, where I talk about immigration and the immigrant church. But the first generation, or the immigrant generation, the group that came to the U.S. from Korea, is a very highly churched group. Now, they start off highly church in that there were about 40% who were Christians coming to the U.S. That's pretty high, given immigration patterns. But the study that I was looking at, there were two different studies. That group goes from 40% who were attending church in Korea to 70 to 77% active membership in the church within that generation. So that's a pretty drastic jump from 40% to 77%. By the way, the 77% number is active participation, not just I'm a member of a church somewhere and I go on Christmas and Easter. These are regular Sunday attendees. So we're talking about, and my argument is it's actually that's the second most dramatic conversion evangelism story in U.S. history. The first is conversion of African Americans post-Civil War. That number is sky high as well. It's hard to measure that, but it's probably higher than that. But the second most is the conversion of Korean Americans in the first immigrant generation to church involvement. Wow. And that was the factors that I was mentioning earlier, that it provides this kind of social space. It provides a spiritual safe space that this generation really needs. But we do know that when you get into the second generation, the children of the immigrants, the children of the first generation, there is a notable drop-off in that second generation. The numbers decline, the percentage of participation declines. This is across the board, by the way, and pretty much every kind of generational dynamic of immigrants. The first generation is much more active in the church. The next generation, subsequent generation, tends to decline in church involvement. There is a secularization that happens. But there's also assimilation that happens. So that when you get to the second or third generation, you start seeing second generation Korean Americans go to Pan-Asian churches or go to multi-ethnic churches or attend majority white churches. So that's one of the trends that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years, that the first generation churches flourish as ethnic specific, language specific, culture specific churches, but the second generation doesn't always adhere to that pattern. And there's probably three outlets. One, they leave the church altogether, and that is actually notable. But that happens with every kind of second generation. Happens white churches, black churches. The children of Christians, you can never bank that they're going to stay in church. So there's always that percentage, and this isn't true in the immigrant churches, where the second generation, the children of immigrant believers, end up going somewhere else or not going to church altogether. Sorry, they leave the church. Right. And then there's a percentage that stay in the immigrant church, but oftentimes try to find their own expression. So they start a youth service, or they start an English service, or they create kind of these own spaces that they're interacting within the church, but they also try to remain separate. And then the third is they end up going to the larger churches or immigrant or multi-ethnic churches or majority culture churches. And we saw that a few years back, and this was the noted pattern where a lot of the white mega churches in the suburbs, they were becoming more diverse because of the influx of second generation immigrants, also African Americans. So this was part of social uplift. So as immigrant generations, by the second generation, they have a higher income, more education. They leave the Chinatowns, they leave the little Tokyos, they leave the little Saigons, kind of these ethnic communities and urban centers, and they start moving to suburban communities. And when they move to the suburbs, sometimes they start their own churches. They may be Pan-Asian churches, they may be second-generation Asian churches, but oftentimes they will join the Willow Creeks and the Saddlebacks, and that's where these kind of mega churches saw a spike in ethnic, a lot of Asians going to these churches and getting involved in these churches. A lot of it was location and ease of access and programs that they were offering. So if you go to places like Willow Creek and Saddleback, the second largest ethnic group after white are almost always Asian at these mega churches. And that's part of that third thread of some left the church altogether, some stayed in the immigrant church, and another percentage went to the larger church context, some to multi-ethnic churches, others to predominantly white churches.
And, you know, I've only visited Redeemer in New York a few times.
Yeah.
And I remember the first, I don't know which service, I'm not sure which place, but I remember walking in and I was like, this church is like 80%
it's high.
Asian. I was like, and you know, I've only listened to Tim Keller online, and you know, he's about as white as a white guy can be, right? I mean, like just his speech patterns. And I mean, he's a brilliant preacher. I mean, I think possibly the best preacher alive in the English language, in my opinion. And so I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be a staid Presbyterian white church. And I was like, I think I'm in the wrong place. I mean, literally coming in, I thought, maybe I walked into the wrong room, but you know, I'm already here. I guess maybe they have an early service. It's another church, or I don't know. And sure enough, up walks Tim, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. So, yeah, that has definitely been my experience.
Well, there's actually some specific issues, good and bad and troubling.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Tell me what you think works about that and doesn't work about it, because, you know, in our movement, there's always conversation around a multi-ethnic church versus monocultural churches.
Right.
And how do we think about that? Like, you know, like, do we just say, you know, we need as many options as there are to help reach people, and, you know, our cities are diverse, there's lots of different kinds, or are we saying, no, man, we really are hoping and believing and asking God for multi-ethnic churches, but then some of our monocultural churches are going, well, but wait a minute.
Yes.
You know, listen, we're leading a Chinese church because that's what's enabling us to reach folks. To your point earlier,
yes, yeah,
there's an evangelistic opportunity there.
Yes.
So talk through some of what's the good, the bad, and the ugly of what you're processing, because there's a lot of dynamics there.
Absolutely. Well, let me give you kind of a side story, and I don't think Tim Keller remembers this, but the first time I met Tim Keller, I was in a workshop with him, and I raised my hand, and I said, first of all, I want to acknowledge and thank you for being the pastor of the largest Asian church in America. I don't think he remembers.
That is question. My favorite. I love that story. Okay, that's perfect.
At that time, it was true. It was true. Yeah. His congregation, Redeemer Church, I think the number was about 2,000 Asian Americans in attendance. That was larger. Wow. Now, not Korean churches or Chinese churches, but Asian American church. He had the most Asian Americans in that congregation. And I actually remember talking to him in different contexts about this. And there were a few things that I agreed that this worked. One, as a Reformed Presbyterian, that was almost, the market was like ripe for that in New York City. So that's the 2 points. Mm-hmm. The denominational theological affinity and the location. We're talking about a city in New York where, frankly, in many cases, the Korean and the Chinese immigrant churches dropped the ball. They maybe didn't do as much for their children's generation as they could have. Oftentimes, that generation was working in the immigrant church, but not necessarily being served by the immigrant church. So what I remember, because when I was in college in New York, I think my senior year or the year after I graduated was when Redeemer Church started. And then I started hearing about all my friends who were going there. So a lot of InterVarsity students who were part of InterVarsity and NYU, Columbia, started going to the church. So it was, again, kind of an opportunity moment where it was like, hey, here's this vibrant, theologically aligned church that everybody was kind of beginning to flock through. And of course, that caught the momentum as well. But the theological part is that the Reformed theology, the kind of gospel-centric, if you want to use those terminology, but the real idea of like faith by grace and, these ideas really resonated with Korean Presbyterians, for one, but also those who were kind of struggling with their faith, where their faith in the immigrant churches might have been focusing so much on serving. And so my recollection is that there were a number of folks who would go to their home church, meaning their parents' church, and serve as youth leaders, as children's pastors, and then go to one of Redeemer's services as their church. So that was kind of an interesting pattern that was happening back then as well. So I think going back to the single ethnic, multi-ethnic issue, I think it's got to be both and, because they're serving different needs and different people have different needs. So the story that I tell again of my mom, I was the pastor of a multi-ethnic church. And when she would visit, she would go to another church before coming to my service. And I would be deeply offended. I was like, Mom, I'm the pastor here, and you're going to another church.
Totally. You know who I am, right? Right, yeah.
And she's like, well, all your sermons are in English. You talk really fast, And she would just sit in the back and pray and read her Bible, Korean Bible while I'm preaching. So I probably should have taken offense at that. But I understood, because she needed that worship service in her own language, and even in some places in her own cultural expression, not just even the language expression. So I still feel that there is a need for single ethnic churches, especially in the immigrant community, and even into the second generation, because the second generation have unique experiences that might require a unique space. So we know about recently the whole slew of violence that occurred against the AAPI community. And for many AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders, to see that in the news and then to go to their multi-ethnic church and be told that was not a racial incident would have been really, really difficult. In fact, that happened to me, not to my church, but on the heels of the Atlanta shooting, I was trying to process this because, when they started reading the names and the ages, there were women in their 70s. My mom passed away around that time. She was 88 when she passed away. And those are the kind of jobs she had. She was working the service industry. She was cleaning up. She was cooking meals and, doing the kind of things that people in the service industry do. And that's what these women were doing. And then they get labeled as sex workers. They get labeled as, it was just gut-wrenching for many of us in the AAPI community. And then to hear our good-intentioned white friends or good-intentioned multi-ethnic friends say, oh, that wasn't a racial incident. Or, oh, hey, come on, don't worry about that. That doesn't happen. That that was very harmful and hurtful. And so for many of us who maybe that's a more common experience, and especially on the heels of something like that, are we going to go to communities where that's not understood, where that's even rejected and told, oh, you shouldn't think that way, or this is not what's important. It's really all about the gospel. And, as long as you're saved, why are you worrying about these, 70-year-old women that got killed, or this Filipino woman that got assaulted in New York, or, all these 6,000 cases of violence against the AAPI community. Why are you worrying about that? Just pray and read your Bible. So for many of us in the AAPI community, to hear that at our church, where our pain should be heard and listened to, and it was shut down, that's where many folks said, I don't want to be there. And some left the church, but others would say, I need to be in a community that understands what that feels like, the connectedness of the sorrow, the lament, the common lament of our community being assaulted. That's where I think it was very difficult for many to say, well, but I'm in a community that doesn't get that. And so there's that both and. I do believe that there are spaces where the healing, the restoration, the specificity of ministry, especially for marginalized groups, is necessary. But there should also be a place where we can be involved in multi-ethnic and multicultural ministries. Yeah, that's good. It's never one or the other. It's always a both and, in my opinion.
Every month, we introduce a new recommended resource to dig in deeper. September's book of the month is Prophetic Lament by Soong-Chan Ra. If you've been enjoying this episode with Jay and Soong-Chan, make sure to check out the book.
Well, that's good. Well, let me get back to your story because I want to dial into Lament, of course, because you've written some beautiful things to that. But tell me, so then you end up planting a church? Is that sort of your... Wow. Okay. So you plant a church with the ECC?
No, not back then. So I went to seminary.
Okay.
I did seminary at Gordon Conwell, and I got my MDiv from there. And then I went to Harvard for a master's degree in theology. And the focus there was on my thesis on immigrant churches, actually. And a lot of my research that I write about in one of my books comes from that research project that I did at Harvard. So I had spent 5 years in seminary. And during that time, seminary and div school. And during that time, I was also on staff with the university and working on the MIT campus in particular. And then I was also involved with a church back in DC. I had planted a church in the DC area, but I was in school in Boston. So I would actually fly back and forth from Boston and DC to serve on weekends at the church in DC, and then fly back and take classes and work with the university at MIT. And I was kind of doing that for a number of years. And then the church in Maryland actually said, wisely said, you probably can't keep this up. What do you think about planting a church in Boston? I said, I would love that. And so they actually was financially supportive of a church planting effort in the city of Cambridge. And the good part was that I had a couple of things that helped me in that kind of early church planting stage. One was I had lived in Boston and Cambridge for 5 years at that point. I had gone to 3 years of Gordon Conwell, 2 years at Harvard. So I was very familiar with that neighborhood. I had served at MIT's InterVarsity for 5 years prior to that. I had been interning at another church, Cambridge Church of the Nazarene, which was right in Central Square, which actually where the church would start at. So I wasn't kind of like parachuting into a community that I knew nothing about. I had spent 5 years in some form involved and connected to the Cambridge community, and mostly with college students, but Cambridge is a college town. And then the church that I was connected to there were many friends that I had in that church who were more in the community. So that was the kind of the genesis of the church in 1996. And it was intentionally multi-ethnic from the very beginning. So I give the date 1996 because you got to remember that the multi-ethnic phenomenon is a more recent reality than it is a longer history. So back in 1996 in the city of Boston, or in the Boston area, there were maybe 3 churches that identified as multi-ethnic total. One was a Black-white racial reconciliation church that was intentional. The other 2 were accidentally multi-ethnic, as in somehow or another the church became multi-ethnic and they were just kind of like figuring out what to do. Almost all the other churches were at least 90% one race or higher than that, mostly. So there was a real hyper-segregation in the churches. Now, if you go back and look at the numbers in 96, you find it's across the board, not just in Boston, in New York and in Chicago and LA, and certainly in the South and in the West, in the North. Everywhere you went, you saw hyper segregation. Churches divided along racial, cultural, national, ethnic lines. It was kind of the norm back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. There's a lot of reasons for that, but that was the norm. And so when we started the church in 96, we were intentionally trying to start a church that was a little bit different from that. That actually was more involved as a multi-ethnic church, as an urban church, as a church concerned about the needs of the community, and not just going door to door and knocking and saying, hey, come to church. We actually wanted to serve the community and to say, hey, your kids, what would it be like to serve your kids with after-school programs? What would it be like to serve the senior citizens in our neighborhood? What would it be like to have summer camp for your kids or VBS for your kids that are in the community, even though our church is mostly young adults? So that was the genesis of the church, especially after having done campus ministry for 5 years. And as I was doing campus ministry, I was recognizing that we had these brilliant young men and women, Harvard MIT students, who were at the top of their class and just some of the most brilliant minds you're ever going to meet. And oftentimes, especially for the ethnic churches, a bus would come, pick them up, at Harvard, drive them to a suburban church 30 minutes away. And they would bypass all these churches that are in the city. And when we started our church, the intention was, no, let's actually have these students connect with their neighborhood where they live, where they don't venture out too much, just down the block to a different part of the city. So that was kind of our motivation when the church started back in 1996. Intentionally multi-ethnic, intentionally urban, intentionally focusing on the needs of the community around issues like justice and concern for the poor.
Wow. And to your point, that you're right, that wasn't as clear a target for most, specifically in the church growth kind of world. Like it was, church growth was actually working over homogeneity, right? Like if we can get things similar, our odds of growing go up. So
there was actually some, and I've read these texts on this. There's some significant literature on this topic that actually focuses on exactly what you're describing. Right. And there are book titles like "Our Kind of People," and the idea that we will grow a church if people like us hang out together. Even some of the more popular books like "Purpose Driven Church," where they said, find a target and pick that target and have that, that target come to your church. And the pictures were a white man in his 40s with khaki pants and golf shirt and cell phone and, loafers. It was very specific without even thinking how racially and ethnically charged those comments were. That if you are trying to attract people like yourself, then there's some racial cultural dynamics that go into that. And even certainly socioeconomic and educational dynamics also come into that. So that was a time period, probably in the 80s and 90s, at the height of this church growth movement. And one of the foundational pieces to the church growth movement was something called the Homogeneous unit principle, which comes from a secular principle called sociological principle called homophily. Birds of a feather flock together. And it's easier to bring people together who are similar to each other. Some of that is education, some of that is class, some of that is a job and occupation. A lot of it is race and culture. And so a lot of the churches that grew in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, intentional or not, they followed that principle. And so you saw the growth of these churches and the growth of the evangelical movement as a whole that was kind of along racialized lines where these racial, ethnic specific churches grew in large numbers. And it really wasn't until the turn of the century, 2000s, that you began to see some of the shift in thinking to say, let's move from single ethnic, racially divided churches to more racially unified churches.
Yeah, that's good. Well, in 1996, you're on the front end of that curve, which is...
Well, we were among the first, yeah.
Wow. And so I want to ask a million questions about that, but I don't know that we can. I mean, because what I'm wondering is I'm listening to you. So I'm listening to how your heart was formed and the story of what you've come through. It would have been easy for you to either say, I'm just going to be Korean church guy because that's where I fit. And it's been great for me. I mean, it's been a benefit. There was no need for you to kind of leave and go do something else. You're obviously highly educated. So, and people go to Harvard have done something pretty well. I mean, they don't just say, let's take anybody. So you're obviously educated, you're bright, you're successful. What made you say, you know what, I'm going for this? This is worth everything. Because to your point, faster methods of growth, this is not like easy work, right? So, and I imagine this might naturally lead into talking about Lament. How did that get just stuck into you? How did you start to say, I got to do this work? This is the work I think God would ask me to do.
That's a great question. And it does go back to, kind of early childhood and seeing this racial division in my community and saying and maybe it was something innate, or maybe it was the Holy Spirit speaking through me saying, this doesn't seem like the best. It seems like we can do better than this. The church I'm speaking about, maybe not my neighborhood, maybe not the society, but the church should be doing better than this. And then to have like pockets of places, especially where I saw when the kingdom of God in its diversity was presented to me. And I said, oh, this is amazing. This is great. So when I was in college, when I was part of a varsity, having grown up in the Korean church, to be at a place that was more multi-ethnic and to learn different ways of doing ministry and relating, and, the ways that we were doing certain things that was not something I had learned in the Korean church. I went to my first African-American church when I was in college, Allen AME in Queens, Jamaica, New York. And I'm watching this church, a huge church that was doing incredible work everywhere in that community. They were doing housing projects. They were doing after-school tutoring. They were working with the poor. They were working with the elderly. They were working with everybody in that community. And I didn't quite see that growing up to the extent. I mean, we cared for other Koreans who were struggling, but this church was out there everywhere doing all sorts of things for the community. And I realized, my world's been pretty small. And I needed to see these examples of the Allen AMEs and these churches that are doing some incredible work that I hadn't seen before. And one of those things is that as your world broadens and gets larger, you realize how large of a God we serve and how much you want to be a part of the larger work that God is doing. The other place that it's really shaped me is to have these incredible, and especially in the early stages of my ministry, African-American mentors, pastors who were there for me. When the church started, I was 29 years old. That's way too young, by the way. If you're 29 planning a church, don't do it. Take my word. Trust me.
I planned it right after my 25th birthday.
Exactly. And
not smart. Yeah, not smart. I agree. Yeah,
I'm saying this kind of tongue in cheek, but we know the challenges to plan at that age and to
precisely.
try to do. And so I'm 29. I'm trying to plant in an urban neighborhood. I'm like, what am I doing? What's going on? And that's really when Ray Hammond, Bishop Ward, and Bishop Green, these wonderful African American pastors, Pastor Lorraine Thornhill, Sister Virginia Ward. These are just kind of giants of ministry in the Boston area. Eugene Rivers. Herman Hamilton. I mean, I could really go on and on about this and these were not people who had a lot of time on their hands. They pastored their own churches, large, influential, successful churches. And I know the story that before I planted the church in Cambridge, I think I went to 9 different African-American pastors and said, would you mentor me?
Wow.
They all said yes. And 8 out of 9 followed up deeply. Every other week, they'll call me and say, how are you doing? It's time for lunch. Or, hey, I'm going to swing by, And I remember when I left the church and was moving to my faculty position after 10 years at the church, most of those African-American pastors who had kind of mentored me those 10 years, they came to my second to last service and they kind of stood up in front of the congregation and said, we've loved your pastor these many years and we care about you as a congregation. So we're here for the congregation as well, even as your pastor's moving to a different city. Those kind of relationships, you realize, that's what the kingdom of God is about. Yeah. And why would I deny myself that? Why would I say, that's not something I want in my life because I'm comfortable in my ethnic specific church or I'm comfortable in my particular socioeconomic group or my education group. Those experiences, I got to ride around in the back of a police car with Ray Hammond, visiting at-risk youth at their homes. I got to, participate in the street work that African-American churches were doing. These are not things you take for granted. These are things that come because God is a bigger God than my little world that I grew up in. And so I don't know. I really am fortunate because these doors were open for me. Yeah,
that's true. But let's be fair. How many pastors do you think go and explicitly ask to be mentored?
Yeah.
It's probably not that many. You've met enough church planners in your day, and so have I. Most church planners are showing up going, let me show you how this is done, everybody. Watch this. I got a call from God. Every city that anyone's planning a church in is the center of witchcraft for the country. Usually, there's some kind of there's something
evil. Yeah,
exactly. This is such an evil place, and these people are so unchurched, and we're here to do the thing nobody's done.
We're going to save this city with our Greater things are yet to come. Greater things are yet to be done in this city. My least favorite song in the world.
I love it. That's a fun question to ask people is, what is your most hated worship song? I think I'm going to start asking that. That is a good one. Anyway, I mean, it just strikes me that you were willing to say, I need to learn from these people that are different than me. They do ministry different than me. They grew up in different backgrounds than me. And I'll tell you what, listen, like, I'm sure this is your experience. Anybody I know that's worked in multi-ethnic ministry and been successful, and it's fruitful and it's life-giving for them,
yeah,
and to people that they serve, they've all done that out of relationship. It's all been out of relationships. It's been, I got to know this pastor, or, I had this one neighbor, or, it was a friend of a friend that I connected to, and I started to realize, I don't understand your story. And they took the posture of a learner. So they went, I'm not here to do anything. I'm here to learn from you.
Yeah.
And that's doable. Anybody can do that. That anybody can say, there's this group of folks in our city. I don't know anything about them. I bet I can learn from them. What if I just showed up and said, tell me what you're learning, or can I just do what you're doing? Like you're saying, I'm riding around in a car. That's an incredible model and a witness of your heart, not just your ability. That's a choice you have to make.
And I think the language that I use, and this comes from the Black church as well, pastors need pastors is what I learned from the Black church. And so Bishop Green, Bishop Ward, Warren Collins, they were willing to be my pastors. And what's interesting about Lorraine Thornhill, Bishop Green, and Bishop Ward is they were second-generation pastors in the city of Cambridge. Their fathers had started the churches, and they were now the pastors of the. And they were all three of them were about 5 years older than I am, so a little further along. So their churches, their family churches, have been around for 2 generations. And so for me as a newcomer to Cambridge, to be able to sit at their feet and to hang out with them, that was huge. And their willingness to do that as well. Because, they could have easily said, look, who are you? You just got here.
I don't know what you're doing.
Just gotten there, right? And yet there was this incredible willingness and graciousness to say, come on, walk alongside us. Yeah. And again, these were second-generation pastors. Their fathers, they had been in that community their entire lives. And they could have very easily said, what are you doing here? And I would have said, you're right. What am I doing here?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Very gracious to me. Yeah.
Wow, that's powerful. Okay, so pivot toward, you've done some great writing, some great thinking on Lament. Now, of course, as we come through the murder of George Floyd, we had all kinds of churches all of a sudden talking about Lament. White churches are now, the sort of, a lot of the model was, let me go find some usually Black male pastor who can tell me a story of their life and what we need to learn as white churches, which is a good first move.
Yeah.
But as so many of these things go, and then there's all these lament services, and as all these things go, it just all sort of dwindles away, and as COVID ends, we just all sort of get back to ministry the way we were. Frankly, a lot of pastors are going, gosh, I hardly even have a church at this point. I'm barely doing this out of COVID. And so there's this spike of attention and activity, a lot of language around lament. And at least in my estimation, I might be being unfair or unkind, but it feels as though it's just sort of drifted back to people just sort of doing ministry as normal. Tell me about your journey towards learning in that, because obviously that would come naturally out of some of the mentoring you've gotten. You start to learn traditions and whole ways of understanding faith. Talk a little bit about your journey toward that and some of what you've been learning and writing about.
Sure. Well, the initial motivation to study the Book of Lamentations, so my book, Prophetic Lament, is a commentary on the Book of Lamentations, is going back to the church plant. The very first full sermon series that I gave at the church was on the Book of Lamentations.
Wow. Well, hold on. That is like anti-church growth talk right there. Yeah.
The least seeker-sensitive, user-friendly book of the Bible.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so you're like, let's do Lamentations, because we all hear multiple series on this through our life. Or wait a minute, never. Then you're like, no, this is going to be great. Wow. Okay.
I teach church planting in the seminary. I was like, that's something I would say, don't do this at home. Don't try this on your own. Don't do this.
That's so
do as
great.
I say, not as what I have done. But that was a little bit counterintuitive in one sense.
Yeah.
But for me, it made sense at the time, and it still does in reflection. But you had a hyper-accomplished community. Harvard MIT students. You had brilliant young men and women who had never failed in their life in so many ways. And they were about to enter into urban ministry and justice-oriented ministry without any kind of sense of how do you address brokenness and suffering and struggle in the world when you've never actually had that experience? And because you've never had that experience, you see it through the lens of, I can fix this. I can figure this out. Because I figured everything else out. I figured out the code to get a perfect score on my SATs. I figured out the ways that I can get straight A's at MIT. You figured it out. You're right. But this is not one of those cases where you're going to just, study all night, pull an all-nighter, and figure out how to fix the problems of the city. What you need is, and that's why I introduced Lament as the kind of an early and important discipline for a church like ours. And I think all churches, especially churches in the U.S. And what I was saying is that there's these strong narratives and imaginations that are kind of embedded into our church life in the U.S. in particular. And they tend to revolve around like exceptionalism, triumph, success-oriented narratives. So we want to talk about and learn from the big churches, right? I mean, hey, that's what we want. Even when we talk about multi-ethnicity, we want to learn from the successful, big multi-ethnic churches. That's who those are our models. And so there's a very capitalistic, consumeristic mentality that comes from the way we view church as a commodity and as something that we want to build a success out of. Numerical success, influence success. There's a lot of different ways we want to gain power and influence through our church successes or through this exceptionalistic, triumphalistic narrative around our churches. And because of that tendency, because it's kind of become deeply embedded in our imagination and narrative, that we end up operating reflexively out of that. I compare it to like a method actor who gets so into a character that the lines they improvise line up with that character because that's how they think. That's how they've conditioned themselves and practiced being in that character. And so we have conditioned ourselves to think exceptionalism, triumphalism, capitalism, these kind of narratives of American greatness, American church greatness. We should always succeed. We should never lose. We should always win. And when those narratives, which are not necessarily biblical narratives, by the way, when those narratives get embedded in, our reflexes operate out of that. And some dysfunctional expressions of church have come out of these dysfunctional embedded narratives. So how do you address dysfunctional embedded narratives that lead to dysfunctional behavior? You can't do more of that dysfunctional behavior. You've got to create new patterns of behavior, or to that dysfunctional narrative, you address it with counter narratives.
Yeah, counter narrative. Exactly. Yep.
You can't say, okay, we've done it this way. We've focused on exceptionalism and triumphalism, and we focused on ways of fixing the problem solving that has worked in the past. And we're going to do that, for example, for race. And so we're going to bring in experts on race. And sadly, post-George Floyd, these experts on race were not experts on race. They were experts on church growth. And it was cringeworthy, some of the comments that were out there by, bluntly speaking, white evangelical leaders who had no experience in talking or thinking or even reflecting on race. Their embedded narratives was triumphalism, exceptionalism, success orientation. And so when their answers came out, it came from that space. And we didn't hear the lament of those who did not succeed in a racialized society. And we kept hearing from those who succeeded in the racialized society for the answers to why our society was racialized. And that's when lament is important, because places like the Black church, places like African American, Native American stories, they offer a counter narrative to the existing exceptionalism, triumphalistic narrative. A historical example that I often give is Bonhoeffer. And everybody loves Bonhoeffer, from fundamentalists to liberals. We all love Bonhoeffer. But my favorite story about Bonhoeffer is that he actually grew up in the context of privilege. His grandfather was the chaplain to the Kaiser. His father was on the faculty at the University of Berlin. It's like being a Harvard professor. There was privilege in his family. And so he could have very easily slipped into German exceptionalism. And early on, some of his writings actually reflect that, especially when he was a child and when he was younger. There was a very strong German exceptionalism. And after World War I, there was this whole push to make Germany great again. And that narrative was part of Bonhoeffer's upbringing. And the thing that actually changed that was when he came to the U.S. to study. And he came to Columbia University, Union Seminary, and he befriended the one black student at Union Seminary, Frankie Fritz. And they went together to Abyssinian Baptist Church, which is a historic black church. And Bonhoeffer begins to learn at the feet of Adam Clayton Powell, the pastor of that church. And it's actually suspected that the phrase cheap grace actually appeared in Powell's sermon before even Bonhoeffer uses it in his writings. So it's suspected that he got that actually from Powell, not from his own work. So ideas like cheap grace, that comes from this community. And what you see in the black church, in Abyssinian Baptist Church, is a community that has suffered, but was not responding with exceptionalism and triumphalism, but responding with a gospel narrative, with a very different narrative that was embedded. And that changes Bonhoeffer. It's documented that Bonhoeffer took a whole stack of gospel music albums back to Germany. And when he started the Free Seminary, he would play these gospel songs as a way of introducing his themes on ethics and around theology. So we see an individual who is steeped in privilege and whose formation was in privilege, German academic intellectual greatness. That's his whole life story, frankly, up until that moment. But he encounters suffering, and instead of opting to tap into that narrative of privilege, he taps into the narrative of suffering, lament, so that the answer that he gives is not a perpetuation of that privilege or a perpetuation of that dysfunctional narrative, but a counter narrative. But he learned that counter narrative from another community.
That's a powerful example. And I had known of him being in that church.
Yeah.
And I'd often even heard the cheap grace quote that he had probably grabbed that from within that church. And I'd heard about the gospel record. So when you think about Bonhoeffer as an idea, or maybe someone like him, and you think about the moment we're in right now, like what are the forays by which, like my hunch is lots of people listen to what you're saying here and go, I see it. I see the sort of exceptionalism. I see the triumphal thing.
Yeah.
But are you telling me, so we're not going to be winners, so then what? We're supposed to be losers? Like what? We're not going to be great. We're not trying to make America great again, and we're not trying to make our churches great again.
Yeah.
So we're going to just be what? Like what are you asking me to take on? What are we trying to embrace? Where does the life come from?
Welcome to the gospel message. If you want to be great in God's kingdom, not get power for yourself, but learn to be the servant of all.
Yeah.
And our example is Jesus, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself of the heavenly places.
Yes.
And so, yes, we do give up our assumptions of greatness. Yes, we do give up. And this is actually the absolute perfect moment for this, because I know enough about churches and have visited enough churches in the last couple of years to know that 3 years ago, a church that was 2,000-3,000, they were starting to slip a little bit. They were 4,000 the year before. They were at 3,000, but they still had hopes. Oh, we can stay at 3,000, or we're going to stay at 4. Get back to 4,000. We'll bring in a new worship team, and add a few crystal balls for the reflecting disco balls, and we got this. Yeah, we got this. And then COVID hits, and then it's down to 500. And then everybody's like, oh, we got to get back to personal services.
Yes.
Then we'll get those numbers back up to 2,000, 3,000, maybe even 4,000 again. We know that now that those restrictions are off and people are gathering in person, those numbers have not come back up to 3,000, 4,000. Now, in some cases, it's like 1,000 online, 1,000 in person. But generally speaking, we know that the national trend is a severe drop-off in attendance, in budgets. We've seen megachurches make slashes in their budget, like huge slashes in their staff. I know of churches that had to cut a third of their staff because they can't afford the staff anymore. Their buildings are half empty. Yeah, this is a story all over. It's not just like one person here. I'm hearing this every city, every place. We're seeing variations of this. So we could revert back to this exceptionalism narrative and say, oh, let's make our churches great again. Let's fill the pews and get back to that 3,000, 4,000 magic number. We can get our budget back up and we'll be that great church that everybody, or we can say, maybe God is doing something different. Maybe there is something different that is happening here that we need to embrace and say, what is the lament we need to enter into? And that was the problem I think we talked about earlier about lament. When it came to George Floyd and racialization, people wanted to move too quickly to the next thing. It's like lament. Okay, we're done. It's on the checklist. Once we've done the lament, then our next step is success, right? So lament didn't change the narrative. It almost in some cases reinforced it. It was like, oh, we did the lament. We're on the checklist. Now we have a new wave of exceptionalism and triumphalism on its way. No, lament should lead us into changed lifestyle, into changed attitudes, into changed narratives. And that's where I think many churches dropped the ball, in that they did the obligatory lament service, they did the obligatory sermon on lament, but they went back to the existing narrative of triumphalism. And instead of forming new counter narratives, they went back to the old narratives of exceptionalism, triumphalism. And here we are 2 or 3 years after post George Floyd, and a year coming off of COVID, and I'm not sure how much has really changed from our expectations from 5 years ago.
Okay, so I know we're running out of time, but give me, even if you have one example, like here's where I've watched people walk through and embrace a counter narrative, and it really transforms them and transforms their church. Like it's, because I think when people have been so embedded in the triumphal story, I was poking fun earlier. I was being a little sarcastic, where it's like, oh, so I can't be a winner now, I have to be a loser. But it does make people feel, I don't believe this is true, as though, we're just going to be kind of sad and beaten up, and we're just sort of the worst, and the woe is me. Is that, when you say lament, am I just like walking around like, gosh, why does everything just suck so bad? And why are we so bad at everything? And I know that's not what we're saying.
Right.
So give me like show, even an example, even in your own life, where you're like, man, this is the fruit that's been born. Here's how I come through this into a different place.
Yeah. So, a couple of examples. One, I go back to my experience in the Black church, where a community that laments has some of the most exciting, dynamic worship experiences you can imagine.
Yeah.
Right. Because there's an acknowledgement of lament. There isn't a shoving aside or, sweeping under the rug. Everybody knows that there's moments of lament, but that honesty with God, which to me is what lament at the center of it, honesty with God, leads us to be able to say, okay, then it's out of my hands. It's in God's hands. Versus, I've lamented now, and now what can I do next to fix this thing? Versus, I'm in a state of lament, but it also means that I'm in a state of dependence upon God, and that's where my hope is. So that's one of the pieces, that recognizing that getting out of lament is not a human accomplishment; it is actually a God's graciousness, and how does that change the way we begin to approach lament? The other piece of it is in the Book of Lamentations, for example, there is a shift back and forth between individual and communal lament. So if our lament is individual, then we can be the Eeyores and the hangdogs and the, Debbie Downer, whatever.
Right,
another
totally.
SNL reference.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But that's, nobody wants that. But if there is a community of lament, if there is a sense of we are in this together, that is different as well. And this is the spirituality of lament that is different from the hyper-individualism. Because hyper-individualism says, oh, if you feel like lament now, if you do the right things, you'll get out of it. In a corporate lament, no, you individual could do the right thing, but the community still might have to be in lament.
Yeah.
Or there's a communal shame and communal working out of this lament rather than this individual guilt and, accomplishment of getting over that guilt. So that's the other part of it that I think we missed out on. And part of that communal lament is what we've been talking about, cross-cultural, cross-racial divide. And one of the things I say about Lamentations, one of the most important things that happens is that Jeremiah, who probably wrote down the words of Lamentations, actually doesn't speak as much as you would think, because the narrator, the curator of the content, Jeremiah, the prophet, the learned one, the privileged one, the powerful one, actually shuts his mouth and allows others to speak. And so our angst and our downness is not for ourselves, it's for the community, it's for the other that is a part of our community. And so one of the most powerful things about Lamentations is that Jeremiah's voice is largely quiet, and it's the women, the widows and the orphans, the crippled, the lame, the blind, those have damaged the most by the fall of Jerusalem. And they were not sent into exile because they took only the learned and educated and articulate and those who were literate. And so those who were left behind were the widows, the orphans, and those who could not read or write. And so Jeremiah is writing down their words, and the goal of lament is not, woe is me, the prophet that was not listened to, but the goal is, let's hear the voices of the widows. Let's hear the voices of those who have suffered the most. And I think our lament lost its focus when it became, woe is me, look at me, I've lost my power in society. I'm not allowed to say Merry Christmas anymore. I have to say Happy Holidays. Woe is me. Look at all the privileges I've lost. And, I have to wear a mask, and I'm not allowed to worship at my church anymore. Woe is me. And we forgot that there is a corporate lament that was going on. We should have been leading on the lament in COVID, not leading on the charge to be the ones that, whatever we ended up doing. That felt like this is not what the church was called to do. The church was called to lament those who died. The church is called to lament who are sick, lament those who couldn't get vaccines. Those are the things we should have been lamenting. And instead, we actually went in the other direction. So a communal corporate lament is one of the major pieces that I think we're missing in all of this.
Well, and I like the language you're using where you talk about its honesty, its reality. It grounds us in the real world.
Yeah.
And in that, it also allows us to trust God's sovereignty. It's not all up to us. It's not our power. It's not our wisdom. It's not our money. It's not our cool little games we play.
Amen.
But he can do this. And so strangely, in that sort of releasing of things, we are empowered differently. It's not disempowering, it's actually empowering because it puts us in reality. And so much of the triumphal stuff just jumps you out of reality. It's like you're not allowed to say what's hard or what doesn't work or where you feel like you've fallen short.
That's right.
That grace enables us to truly be people who lament. Well, we're recommending your book because I think it's a beautiful book. It calls us through a whole series of challenges. And I think counter-narrative is the right words. I mean, it feels grating. It feels awkward for most Americans to take that kind of work on, specifically white Americans. But to your point, the black church, many immigrant churches around the country and around the world are like, oh yeah, well this is what it means to be gospel people, obviously. And we're like, oh, that's true, yeah. So it's a great opportunity for us to be able to connect across. And I appreciate you making time to be with us today. My only one question is I'd love to come back and talk to you some more.
Absolutely, let's do it.
All right.
Glad to do it.
Great. All right, peace to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The We Are Vineyard podcast is a production from the team at Vineyard USA. If you've been enjoying the podcast, here's a few ways you can help us. Leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Connect with us online for additional resources. Our website is vineyardusa.org, and we're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at VineyardUSA. Thanks for listening. See you next week.